Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And joining us today is a man who kind of out of character. He's known to many of you, I'm sure, as a critic, I guess. His name is Caleb Crain, but he's not here to talk about some critical stuff that he wrote. He's here rather to talk about his first novel. The title of that novel is Necessary Errors, and is published by Penguin Books. But that's not right, is it? Aren't we supposed to say something else? Random House Penguin Conglomerate Books or something
like that? Yeah. There's probably Random Penguin or Penguin in the House or something.
Well, thanks for coming by anyway, even if we're unsure of the important things. You know, you're a literary critic. Your stuff has appeared in a lot of places: The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, Nation magazine, the New York Times Book Review, and you went to Harvard and Columbia. You've got the precise pedigree for being a literary critic. Now, somehow, and you, as far as I know, you've been successful. Somehow, you decided to publish fiction. What went wrong? I mean, what happened to your thinking that was so logical and positive for such a long time?
Yeah, I don't know.
You woke up one morning.
It's a sad story. Well, the awful truth is that I actually wanted to write fiction all along, and have written for years and years, and have many unpublishable drafts of manuscripts in the basement to prove it, which should never and will never see the light of day.
We can't bribe you. Or
no,
anything.
There's not enough money.
Can't do it. And then after that, you did something called Sweet Grafton.
Yeah, I wrote a novella a number of years ago, and a literary journal called N+1, based out of Brooklyn, was kind enough to publish it.
Good for them. And then comes Necessary Errors.
Yes.
What led to that? Is there a backstory on that? A personal something or other that moved you in that direction?
Well, the story of the novel is that it's about a young man named Jacob who goes to Prague a year too late for the Velvet Revolution, and falls in with a group of expats there and has a series of friendships and love affairs.
They actually develop a circle of sorts.
Yeah, the story is
keep coming back, meeting together, drinking, quote, writing, unquote.
Yeah,
drinking.
The scare quotes around writing are very important. Yeah. Yeah, it's as much about the friends as it is about the main character.
And in a previous interview, you said that you're tempted to say that writing fiction seems to draw more on the less conscious part or parts of one's mind than writing nonfiction does. But upon further reflection, you're not so sure?
It feels to me like nonfiction is more experience near, as the psychologists say, where it's I feel like I just go and sit in the library and read a lot of books and take notes, and then when it comes time to write it, it's a pretty no-nonsense task.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas fiction, there's this horrible mystical element to it where I don't actually know if any given day I'm going to be able to write anything. But then, yeah, on second thought, the more I think about it, there's something a little bit not entirely under one's control with nonfiction either. That you don't always necessarily know where a line comes from, even in just an essay.
No, and the other thing is your angle, I would suppose, is something, and you're sometimes not sure where the heck that came from.
Yeah, I think with nonfiction, you feel like it's coming from the material, but that may not always be true.
And I think if it's coming only from the material, it's pretty dull.
Yeah.
It's got to come, in my opinion, from someplace else. Well, I don't know whether this is a fair question, but is there more or less satisfaction in fiction than there is in nonfiction? I mean,
I think
what's the degree of rush? I suppose,
yeah.
as a writer.
There can be a rush with nonfiction, but I feel like writing fiction is closer to my heart. I don't. Yeah, I mean, there can be something very personally satisfying about writing an essay, especially if you sort of taking your own slant on something. But fiction, sometimes writing it just felt therapeutic. It felt like I don't know. I'm not on Prozac, but what I hear being on Prozac is like that's sort of what it felt like when it was going well. When it was going badly, of course, it was much different.
You said before that the book is set in Prague after the revolution there, and I was wondering why. Why would you set it there?
Well, to some extent, it's opportunistic because I happened to live in Prague 23 or 4 years ago.
Okay.
It is fiction, but it seemed like a setting that I knew, so I could make use of it. Some
of those clubs exist that are mentioned?
I haven't been back since 1993, so I don't know if they
Probably
exist.
not.
I have a feeling
clubs tend to come and go.
Yeah, if they do exist, I doubt that they're anything like what they were then.
The other thing that's going on here is that there's young expatriates, particularly one, who is very much concerned that he got there after the revolution, that it's past him, and there's quote nothing or little that he can do. That's a terrible feeling.
Yeah, but I feel like I wonder sometimes if young people always feel that way, that if you're young, you're showing up in the middle of a story that's already happening. And that itself seems in some ways interesting, that kind of feeling of coming late.
Now, we have to break now for a commercial. And when we return, we're going to spend some more time getting to know your main protagonist, Mr. Jacob Putnam. Stay tuned. He's fascinating.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Today we're talking about a novel. It's called Necessary Errors. And it's written by a man who usually critiques other people's work. And today we'll do a little critiquing of his work. And it's published by Penguin Books or Random Penguin Books International or something like that. The book has received many gracious pre-pub comments, one of them coming from a gentleman named of Alexander Chi, who's written, among other things, a book called Edinburgh. I don't know, he says, that I've ever read a novel that gets down the way this one does, how it felt to be an American and a gay man at the end of the Cold War. So exiled from the country you grew up in that you go abroad to make a new world. Caleb Crain's Necessary Errors is an adventure of the head and the heart. His hero, Jacob, turns to the cafes, the bedrooms, and the libraries of newly free Eastern Europe, an American in search of a European, what is that word?
Bildungsroman.
Bildungsroman.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
I think it's a German word for like a novel of development.
Okay. In search of a European, in search of love, and possibly both. I think that's, one way to sum up Necessary Errors' main character and what he's about. But the story that you tell, I think, is much richer and much deeper. Jacob arrives in Prague, I believe, with a project. I mean, the big project has passed him by. The revolution is over. Everybody in life, everything in his life up to now was prelude. And his recent discovery that he loves men rather than women strengthened this kind of feeling. He's looking for people who were heroic so he could join them. And yet, he felt it was too late for such a quest. That's an interesting guy. And where does he come from? Is he a combination of many people in your life, or?
I think the reason it resonated with Alex is that it was a difficult time to be gay in America. The AIDS crisis was at its most intense and kind of bitter politically, and it was it felt very it felt like everything was kind of polarized, and maybe that's not necessarily a pleasant field in which to try to find romance or
and
happiness.
it was also a time, at least as I remember it, where the AIDS crisis was insoluble.
Yeah,
there was no answer around.
There wasn't
at that stage.
Yeah,
and the bodies just kept piling up.
Yeah, no, it's at that point. Yeah, there was at most someone with a diagnosis had 10 more years. I think was sort of the conventional wisdom. Yeah.
The interesting thing is that there is a notion in psychology that you mentioned in an interview that it's called a psychological moratorium. That as your character gets to Prague, he's going to go on a psychological moratorium, or as you say, this means Bohemia.
Yeah, I think Jacob is somebody who's not really sure he wants to grow up. It's not really clear what that the cost benefit analysis tells him that he should.
Whether the cost benefit analysis would work out.
Right, and I think Czechoslovakia felt like a sympathetic place to be because it was also in a between state between communism and capitalism.
Yeah,
and the economics there hadn't really worked themselves out yet.
There he is in Prague, Czechoslovakia, at this time when there's a lot of economic confusion among other kinds of confusions, and it turns out that the only job really available or practical was teaching English as a second language.
Yeah, well, that was the job available to expats. Yeah.
I find that very interesting. I don't know why. But
really?
I do. Yes.
Those scenes were fun to write. I don't know. I had to come up with lesson plans for the characters then to derail in the course of teaching or not being taught.
Yeah, and that brings to mind one of the interesting techniques that you use in the book. Characters off and on speak different languages, mostly English or Czech. And when it's a Czech speaker, you don't use quotation marks, you use a dash.
Yeah.
So that it's quite clear as you go through the book what's going on.
Oh, good.
And it is, it remains an issue. Because the other issue at stake, of course, is communication.
Yeah, I think that's another aspect of sort of betweenness in the novel, is that Jacob is kind of between this English-speaking group of friends and then these Czech-speaking people. And yeah, it's all about translations.
We will come back shortly and talk about some other things that come up in this book that are equally fascinating. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is the guy who reads the book. The book we've been reading is Necessary Errors, a wonderful novel by Caleb Crain, published by the wonderful folks at Penguin Books, who are now at Random House or someplace out there. I remain confused. One of the people who said good things about the book is a woman by the name of Megan Dum, D-U-M. As someone who is often unduly nostalgic about having been in her 20s during the 1990s, though not for as good a reason as having been in Prague during the aftermath of the Velvet Revolution, this novel triggered something like a sense of memory. Caleb Crain is remarkable at capturing the time in life when ambition and longing are at once all-consuming and all over the map. I like that combination, consuming and all over the map, because that very much describes where the people in the book are, doing this, doing that, trying this, trying that. I winced in self-recognition, Megan says, more than once, and marveled at the author's insights more often than not. And you sent her a check? That's very good, and I rather agree with that. One of the things that is really wonderful about the book is the writing itself. And one of the ways to let people know how good it is to have you read from the book. Could you give us the context before you begin the reading?
Sure. This is a short passage where Jacob is on his way to the grocery store.
Early
early on, yeah,
in his career.
He's still sort of acclimating to the new environment. In the shadow of the ugly sheltering wall, it was cold, and Jacob was sorry he hadn't put on his sweatshirt under his raincoat. He didn't have his real winter clothes yet. His mother was going to mail them soon. 3 houses down, a border collie ran to the fence as he approached and began to bark industriously. Zli Pes read a little tin sign in black and white. Evil dog was the literal translation. Jacob could see in the collie's eyes that if the fence hadn't been there, it would have let him pass quietly. The fence was a kind of permission to bark, maybe even an obligation. As soon as Jacob stepped past the yard, the collie fell silent and trotted back to its doormat on the front steps, where it curled up to save its warmth. None of the laws liberalizing commerce had yet gone into effect, so the stores were still run on the old system and bore their old plain names: foodstuffs, meat, fruits and vegetables, frozen goods. As if to emphasize their plainness, the words appeared on the signs in lowercase. The stores were lodged in an L-shaped 2-story mall of rough cement. Jacob pushed through a delicate chrome turnstile to enter the largest one, which was on the ground floor. There were only 3 aisles, and most of the shelves were empty. In the back, however, there was a great mound of bottled beer, without any labels on the brown glass. Only the metal caps told you the brand was Staropramen, which Jacob liked. It was absurdly cheap, but it was absurdly cheap in pubs and bars, too, so Jacob never bought any here. There were no spare shopping baskets, because it was the end of the day and the store was crowded, so Jacob cradled in the crook of his left arm the groceries he found. A rectangular paper sack of rice, a jar of half-pickled red cabbage, a brick of butter in foil, and milk in a clear plastic bag with blue stenciling. With tongs, he put into a small white paper sack 5 rochliki, Czech croissants, slightly pasty in flavor. They were straight, like swollen fingers, because at some point under socialism, the traditional curve had been eliminated as frivolous. He approached a board where sour brown bread was stacked. He wanted a quarter loaf, which he risked picking up with a bare hand. Last, at an unplugged refrigerator cabinet against the wall, he picked up a white paper sack of eggs. The sack was the same kind as for roliki, but with 6 eggs already inside, the top neatly crimped shut. He balanced it on the bag of milk, reasoning that the milk might provide cushioning, like a waterbed. The cashier wrote out his total on a scrap of paper as she pronounced it, because she knew he didn't understand numbers yet, and then fished the correct change out of his open palm. She sighed as she did it. He felt childish and trusting. There was no greed here, it sometimes seemed. There must be, of course, but sometimes it did seem that there wasn't. Upstairs, afterward, he bought some sausage to fry, and in the vegetables and fruits store across the street, he found some onions and salad greens.
Yeah, he's ready to roll.
Yeah,
He's ready. But that gives a wonderful sense of, it's just like home, but it ain't kind of thing, I mean, partly pickled red cabbage. I don't know. I saw partly pickled red cabbage. There are some very interesting, I guess you could call them minor characters. The one that I can't get out of my mind, my memory, is a fellow by the name of Caspar.
Okay.
Caspar. He's perhaps the strangest guy in the cast. He says he loves his father like he loves a dog. That's one of the things. And he's a translator, not a writer, and he's also a commentator. And in order to think, he needs either to be eating or smoking. Like anybody else establishing or beginning one's sexual experience, the main character goes from lover to lover. But I think Milo is the real thing, the man at the end.
Yeah, I think you're really supposed to wonder about that. Yeah.
Well, here I am wondering, doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
What a good reader I am.
Yeah. You've read it very attentively, yeah.
And then at the very end, they all came to see him off.
Mm-hmm.
He's getting on a bus at the bus station. Don't read it now, Milo says of the letter that he gave him. Read it when you're without Prague, as if I had sent it to you by post. Jacob cried, of course, as the bus pulled away. From being people whom he had lived among, his friends became a picture of the same people falling behind him. That's really right on target. The difference between a relationship being lived, at the end of it, wave goodbye. There are many great moments in Necessary Errors, a new novel by Caleb Crain. We've been talking about it here on Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.